The night after my father's funeral, my husband poured me a glass of red wine from my father's private cellar and said, "Drink, Evelyn. Your father wouldn't want to see you suffer like this." Celeste Vale, his secretary, stood beside the dining table with a folder pressed against her chest, her black dress too fitted for mourning, and her eyes too dry for someone who had just watched my family bury its patriarch. Rain dragged silver lines down the tall windows of Bellamy House, turning the chandeliers into trembling ghosts above us. I remember looking at the glass in Julian's hand, at the deep crimson wine catching the light like something alive, and feeling a strange quiet settle inside me. My father had been in the ground for less than 6 hours. The flowers from the cemetery still smelled damp in the hallway. Yet my husband had brought paperwork, a secretary, and a bottle of wine into my grief like he was hosting a board meeting. I should have refused the glass. Maybe some part of me already knew that. But grief makes hesitation look like weakness, and Julian had built our entire marriage around teaching me that weakness embarrassed him. He held the wine out with that soft public smile of his, the one that made investors lean forward and widows trust him with signatures. "Just a sip," he said. "You haven't eaten. You're shaking." I was shaking, but not for the reason he thought. I had stood beside my father's casket that morning, while Julian accepted condolences as if he were the heir instead of the son-in-law. I had watched Celeste whisper in his ear beside the hearse, and step back too quickly when I turned. Now she opened the folder and slid a document toward me. "It's only a temporary authorization," she said gently. "The board needs reassurance by morning." The ink blurred for a second under the chandelier light. I took the glass because I wanted to watch their faces when I did. That was the truth I would admit only later, when the hospital smell was gone from my hair and the detectives had stopped asking me to repeat the timeline. I lifted the wine, let it touch my lips, and swallowed a small mouthful. It tasted wrong immediately. Not spoiled, not corked, but bitter beneath the oak sharp in a way my father's wine never was. Thomas Bellamy had collected wine like other men collected trophies, and he had taught me enough to know when a bottle was lying. Julian watched my throat move. Celeste's fingers tightened around the folder so hard the paper bent. "Better?" he asked. I set the glass down carefully. "No," I said, and for 1 second his smile slipped. Then the room tilted. My heartbeat struck once too hard, then began to race like something trapped inside my ribs. At first, Julian reached for me like a concerned husband. His hand closed around my elbow, warm and steady, but he did not call for help. That was the detail I would replay later. He guided me toward the chair, not the sofa, not the phone, not the front door where the housekeeper could see us. Celeste moved behind me, fast and quiet. The chandelier fractured into white sparks above my head. My hands went cold. The folder slid from the table papers, spreading over the floor like pale wings. I heard my own breath catch, then Julian's voice lower, now stripped of tenderness. "How much did she drink?" Celeste whispered. "Enough if Naomi doesn't interfere." The name cut through the fog. "Doctor." Naomi Keller had been my father's physician for 7 years, and mine for 3. Julian's thumb pressed against my wrist, checking my pulse not with fear but calculation. That was when I understood. They were not afraid I was dying. They were waiting for it. I tried to stand, but my knees failed. The chair scraped backward, and I hit the floor hard enough to taste blood. Somewhere far away, Celeste gasped too loudly, performing for an audience that had not entered yet. Julian crouched beside me and lifted the glass from the table. Through the narrowing dark, I saw him press it into my right hand, wrapping my fingers around the stem. My father's signet ring, which I had worn after the service because I could not bear to leave it in the drawer, knocked softly against the crystal. "Evelyn," Julian called suddenly loud. "Evelyn, stay with me. Celeste, call an ambulance." But before his voice rose, before footsteps rushed from the servant's wing, I heard Celeste lean close and breathe. "How long before it looks natural?" Julian answered. "Long enough for grief to explain it." I wanted to tell him grief did not explain poison. I wanted to say my father had warned me about men who smiled while measuring your pulse. But my mouth would not move. The ambulance lights painted Bellamy House red and blue while rain hammered the porch roof. I remember pieces after that, broken and floating, the housekeeper crying into her apron, Julian telling the paramedics I had been drinking since the funeral, Celeste holding my coat as if she were helpful, the cold bite of oxygen in my nose. A paramedic asked what I had taken, and Julian answered before anyone else could. "Wine," he said, voice cracking beautifully. "Maybe medication. She's been under impossible stress since her father declined. As if my father had been a quarterly report instead of a man who taught me how to read tide charts and balance ledgers before I was old enough to drive. I tried to open my eyes fully, but the ceiling of the ambulance stretched and folded. Someone said my blood pressure was dropping. Someone else said my heart rhythm was irregular. Julian's face hovered above me, wet from rain or false tears. "Stay with me, darling," he whispered, and I hated him for making the word darling sound like a shovel full of dirt. At St. Anne's Medical Center, they wheeled me past white lights and polished floors. Julian stayed close until a nurse blocked him, and then his performance sharpened. "My wife has anxiety medication," he said. "She doesn't always take it correctly. Her father's death destroyed her." Celeste stood behind him, nodding with her hands clasped, the perfect loyal employee dragged into a family crisis. I heard Dr. Naomi Keller's voice before I saw her. "Who told you that?" she asked. Julian paused. "I'm her husband." Naomi's answer was colder than the rain. "That wasn't my question." Then she was beside me, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, her eyes moving over my face with the calm fury of a doctor who had already sensed the room was lying. "Evelyn, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." I tried. My fingers barely twitched, but Naomi saw it. She leaned closer and said so softly only I could hear, "Hold on. Don't let them write this story." I lost consciousness after that, but not all at once. There were sounds first. Machines. Shoes. Julian in the hallway asking about legal authority if I became incapacitated. Celeste murmuring that the board would need a statement before markets opened. Naomi ordering a toxicology panel no one had requested. Then darkness folded over everything. When I surfaced again, I was not in the main hospital room. The lights were dimmer, the air quieter, and the window beside my bed showed not the city skyline but a private courtyard behind frosted glass. My throat burned. My chest ached, as if someone had clenched a fist around my heart and left bruises there. Naomi sat beside the bed reading a chart with her glasses low on her nose. When she saw my eyes open, she placed one finger against her lips. "Don't speak yet," she whispered. "Your husband believes you're in a medically induced coma in the East Wing." I stared at her, unable to understand. She leaned closer. "Let him believe it." I tried to ask how, but only air came out. Naomi lifted a small cup of water to my lips and let me take the smallest sip. "You were poisoned," she said quietly. "Not drunk, not unstable, not careless. Poisoned. The compound is still being identified, but your reaction was severe enough that if you had consumed the entire glass, I would be speaking to your attorney instead of you." My eyes burned, though no tears came. There is a strange humiliation in surviving your own murder before anyone else has agreed it was murder. Naomi looked toward the door, then back at me. "Julian tried to push for a preliminary report connecting your collapse to alcohol and sedatives. He knew exactly which medications to mention. 2 exactly. My father's funeral returned to me in pieces, Julian's hand at my back, Celeste's black gloves, the folder, the wine, the whisper. How long before it looks natural my pulse began to rise, and Naomi touched my wrist. "Breathe, Evelyn. You need your body calm and your mind sharp." That was when she opened the drawer beside the bed and removed my father's gold pocket watch. The sight of it hurt more than the IV in my arm. Thomas Bellamy had carried that watch every day for 30 years, not because it kept perfect time, but because my mother had given it to him the year he bought his first marina. Naomi placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Your father gave this to me 2 weeks before he died," she said. "He told me if anything happened to him too quickly, or to you too conveniently, I was to make sure you received it privately." The metal was warm from her hand. On the back, beneath my father's initials, a tiny seam ran along the engraving, one I had never noticed before. Naomi pressed the crown twice. The watch clicked open, not at the face, but at the base. Inside, hidden beneath the mechanism, was a black memory chip smaller than my thumbnail. I stared at it until the room steadied around me. My father had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not the wine, maybe not that his daughter would be lying in a private clinic bed the night after his burial, but he had known enough to leave a trail. Naomi took the chip and slid it into a small encrypted reader on the bedside table. For a moment the screen stayed black. Then my father's voice filled the room, rougher than I remembered, weakened by illness but unmistakably his. "Evelyn," he said, and the sound broke something open in my chest. "If you are hearing this, then I waited too long to say what needed saying. Julian is not who he pretends to be." My hand closed around the bedsheet. Naomi's expression did not change, but her eyes softened. My father continued. "He has been moving money through shell accounts tied to the harbor expansion. Celeste Vale helped him. Do not confront them without proof. The recording ended after only 47 seconds, but it changed the shape of my grief forever. Until that moment, I had been a widow's daughter, a poisoned wife, a woman everyone could call unstable if they said it gently enough. After that, I became something else. A witness. A target. A Bellamy. Naomi removed the reader and tucked the chip into a medical envelope. There may be more files, she said. This is only the first one. I looked at the door, imagining Julian in some polished waiting room telling strangers how fragile I was, how devoted he had been, how tragic it would be if I never woke. My voice came back as a rasp. Does he know I'm conscious? Naomi shook her head. No, and for now he cannot. I swallowed against the fire in my throat. Good, I whispered. Let him bury me before I return. Naomi held my gaze, and for the first time that night, she almost smiled. By morning, Charleston had already begun mourning me in advance. Naomi showed me the news on a muted tablet. Julian stood beneath the dripping columns of Bellamy House in the same black suit he had worn to my father's funeral, his wedding ring visible as he pressed a hand to his heart. Celeste stood 3 steps behind him, eyes lowered, face pale enough for sympathy but not enough for guilt. The caption beneath them read, Bellamy heiress hospitalized after tragic collapse following father's funeral. Then Julian's voice came through when Naomi raised the volume. Evelyn has always been strong, he said, pausing exactly where grief should live, but losing Thomas broke something in her. I only ask for privacy, while I do everything I can to protect my wife and her father's legacy. I watched him lie to the cameras with my father's house behind him, and my blood still bruised beneath the IV tape. Then Celeste leaned toward him just slightly, like she already belonged there. I turned off the screen myself. 3 weeks, I said. Naomi looked at me. For what I stared at Julian's frozen face reflected in the black glass, to let them think they won. For the first 3 days after the poisoning, the world believed I was unconscious in a restricted hospital wing, guarded by machines and grief. In reality, I was awake inside a private recovery room behind Dr. Naomi Keller's clinic, learning how it felt to become a ghost while still breathing. Naomi had moved me under a false patient name before Julian's lawyers arrived with questions dressed as concern. She told the hospital administration that I required neurological observation away from press attention, and because Thomas Bellamy had donated the East Cardiac Wing, no one questioned her authority quickly enough to stop it. I lay beneath thin white blankets, listening to my own heartbeat stabilize on the monitor, and watched my husband perform devotion on television. Every statement he made had the same careful shape. Evelyn was fragile. Evelyn was overwhelmed. Evelyn had mixed medication with wine. Evelyn needed protection. By the 3rd interview, I realized he was not explaining my collapse. He was building a cage around my credibility. Julian visited the false room twice a day, carrying flowers and grief like stage props. Naomi had arranged for a sedated patient simulator and strict access limits, enough shadows and medical equipment to satisfy a man who wanted an outcome more than a wife. Through a discreet camera feed, I watched him sit beside the bed and hold a hand that was not mine under the blanket. He bowed his head for the nurses, whispered prayers when they passed, and checked his phone the moment he thought he was alone. Celeste's messages lit up his screen in blue bubbles. Board wants emergency vote. Marcus is asking for original files. Need Evelyn declared temporarily incapacitated before Friday. Julian replied with one thumb, while his other hand still held the decoy's covered wrist. Working on it. Naomi paused the recording and looked at me. He's not waiting to see if you recover, she said. I stared at the screen. No, I answered. He's waiting to see how fast he can replace me. Marcus Reed came to the clinic on the 4th night, through the service entrance, wearing an old raincoat and carrying my father's leather document case. Marcus had been Bellamy family counsel for 22 years, a narrow-faced man with patient eyes and the kind of loyalty people mistake for gentleness until they threaten something he has sworn to protect. When he saw me sitting upright, pale but alive, his mouth tightened with relief. He refused to indulge. Your father feared this, he said, placing the case on the foot of my bed. Not the poisoning specifically, but Julian's appetite. I asked him what Julian had done since my collapse. Marcus opened the case and removed a stack of documents marked urgent. He filed for temporary executive control, citing your medical incapacity. He also submitted a scanned authorization bearing your signature. I reached for the page. My name curved across the bottom, close enough to fool a stranger, wrong enough to insult me. Celeste. I said. Marcus nodded. Likely. She had access to your executive signature files. The first real blow came when Marcus showed me the medical affidavit Julian's attorney had prepared. It described me as emotionally unstable, dependent on sedatives, prone to alcohol misuse, and incapable of making immediate financial decisions. My father had died only days earlier, and my husband had already reduced me to a liability in legal language. I read the sentences twice, each one cleaner and crueler than a shouted insult. Where did he get this? I asked. Naomi took the page from Marcus and scanned it with a physician's disgust. Some of this is pulled from old therapy notes but distorted. Some of it is fabricated entirely. Marcus folded his hands. Celeste requested access to wellness documentation last month, claiming it was for executive insurance renewal. I almost laughed. 1 month before the funeral, my husband's secretary had been preparing to prove I was too broken to own what my father left me. Grief had not made me vulnerable. They had been sanding down my reputation before they ever touched the wine. Naomi connected the memory chip from my father's watch to a secure laptop. This time, the folder opened into multiple files: audio notes, transaction screenshots, copies of emails, and one video recorded from my father's study camera. In the video, Thomas Bellamy sat beneath the green banker's lamp at his desk, thinner than I wanted to remember, but his eyes still sharp. "Evelyn," he said, "if Julian moves quickly after my death, do not assume desperation. Assume preparation." His hand trembled when he lifted a printed wire transfer. $3 million left the Harborview expansion account through a vendor that does not exist. Celeste Vale created the invoice trail. Julian approved the payment. Marcus leaned closer. Naomi was still. My father continued. I confronted him indirectly. He lied too smoothly. Then your medication refill changed without my permission, and I began to wonder if money was not the only thing at risk. The video cut off, and silence filled the room like water rising. That night I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not loudly, not in the way cameras expect grieving daughters to break, but silently, with my hand pressed over my mouth so the nurses outside would not hear. I cried because my father had spent his last weeks afraid for me and had carried that fear alone. I cried because Julian had sat at my father's bedside, held his hand, promised to protect me, and then turned that promise into a weapon. Naomi sat beside me without speaking. After a while, she handed me a tissue and said, "Pain can wait if the truth needs you first, but it cannot disappear." I wiped my face and nodded. "Then we give truth a schedule," I said. Marcus opened his notebook. "We decided I would remain officially unconscious. Naomi would continue blocking Julian's direct medical control. Marcus would delay every legal filing by procedural objection, and I would begin listening to every recording my father had left behind." By the end of the first week, Julian's performance had become bolder. He moved into my father's office at Bellamy Harbor Group and gave interviews from behind Thomas's desk, always with the blinds half open to show the marina beyond. He told staff he was only holding the family together. He told the board I had signed preliminary authority before my collapse. He told the press I needed quiet. Celeste became his gatekeeper. She wore cream blouses now instead of black. Small diamond earrings I recognized from my own drawer, and my father's office key on a thin gold chain around her neck. Ava Monroe, my closest friend and the only journalist in Charleston who hated polite lies more than scandal, sent us photographs from outside headquarters. In one, Celeste stood too close to Julian near the elevator, her hand resting on his sleeve. In another, she entered Bellamy House at midnight and left at dawn. Ava attached one message: "Your grieving husband is bad at pretending when cameras are gone." Ava came to the clinic through the laundry entrance because she said secrecy was easier when people underestimated women carrying towels. She hugged me carefully, avoiding the IV bruise on my arm, then pulled back and looked at me with furious, wet eyes. "I want to publish everything," she said. "Not yet," I told her. "If we expose him too early, he'll deny the affair and bury the money trail." Ava dropped a folder onto the bed. "Then let's bury him properly." Inside were offshore registration documents, vendor shells linked to a Delaware holding company, and photos of Julian meeting a man named Ellis Crow at a private airport hangar. Marcus recognized the name immediately. Crow specialized in moving distressed assets before lawsuits froze them. "Julian is not just trying to control the company," Marcus said. "He is preparing to liquidate pieces of it." I touched the edge of the folder. Bellamy Harbor was not just buildings and docks. It was my father's life in concrete, salt, and signatures. Julian was selling his bones. The second week brought the first direct threat. Ava received a text from an unknown number with a photograph of her apartment door and the words, "Stop confusing grief with conspiracy." She laughed when she showed it to me, but I knew her well enough to see fear tighten around her eyes. Naomi wanted to call Detective Aaron Pike immediately, but Marcus warned that official movement could alert Julian before we understood how much evidence he had destroyed. I asked Ava if she wanted out. She looked offended. "Your husband tried to turn you into a headline and a corpse. I'm not going home because his errand boy found my doormat. Still, we changed tactics." Ava stopped approaching sources directly and began pulling public records. Marcus subpoenaed nothing, yet only requested archived backups under a pre-existing corporate audit clause my father had written years earlier. Naomi documented every lab result twice, once in the hospital system and once in a private notarized file. We stopped chasing Julian emotionally and started building a room with no exits. On the 12th day, Naomi discovered the second layer of the plan. She had sent samples from my medication bottles to an independent lab under a coded request. The results came back at 6:40 inches the morning. She entered my room with no coffee in her hand, which told me everything before she spoke. "Your blood pressure medication was substituted," she said. "Not completely, selectively. Enough to make you vulnerable if combined with alcohol and a cardiac stimulant." My skin went cold. When Naomi placed the report in front of me. "The bottle was refilled 5 days before your father died." 5 days. Julian had kissed my forehead in the pharmacy parking lot that afternoon and told me to rest while he picked up the prescription. Celeste had been in the passenger seat of his car, allegedly reviewing funeral seating arrangements. Naomi's voice lowered. "If you had drunk more wine, your collapse could have looked like a grief-related cardiac event complicated by medication misuse." I stared at the report until the words stopped being medical and became simple. They had not planned a murder. They had planned an explanation. Marcus reacted to the medication report by opening the sealed envelope my father had left with him. He had avoided it until then, saying Thomas instructed him to use it only if harm came to me. Harm had come. Inside was a revised will dated 14 days before my father's death, witnessed properly notarized twice, and accompanied by a video statement. The will did not give Julian anything. It did not even allow him temporary authority through marriage. Instead, it froze all controlling shares of Bellamy Harbor Group for 60 days if I died, disappeared, or became medically incapacitated within 2 months of Thomas's passing. During that freeze, an independent forensic audit would automatically begin. My father's video statement explained why. "If Evelyn is unable to act, I want no one near this company who benefits from her silence." Marcus looked up from the document. "Julian doesn't have this version," he said. "He has the earlier draft." I understood then why Celeste had been carrying papers the night I collapsed. They were not trying to inherit through law. They were racing against the law my father had built to catch them. For the first time since waking, I felt something like air enter my lungs fully. My father had not left me defenseless. He had left me a trap disguised as paperwork because he knew Julian would underestimate anything that did not bleed. We decided not to reveal the revised will yet. Marcus would let Julian proceed under the false assumption that the board could hand him control. Ava would track Ellis Crow and the asset transfers. Naomi would prepare the toxicology record. Detective Pike, brought in quietly through an old connection of Marcus's, would watch without approaching. "We need intent," Pike said during our first secure call. His face on the laptop was lined, skeptical but not dismissive. "Poison proves a crime. Paperwork proves motive. To make a jury feel the architecture, we need them moving inside it." I liked him for that sentence. Architecture was exactly what this was. Julian and Celeste had built a house of lies around my supposed weakness. Now we were measuring the load-bearing walls. By the end of the second week, Julian started calling Naomi more often. His concern sharpened into impatience. "Has there been any meaningful response?" he asked during one call we recorded from Naomi's office. "Her neurological status remains guarded," Naomi replied. "That isn't an answer," he said. Naomi looked through the glass at me as she spoke. "It is the only answer you are entitled to." His silence was brief but ugly. "I am her husband, Dr. Keller. I have decisions to make." Naomi's voice did not move. "Medical decisions, yes. Corporate decisions are outside my chart." He hung up. 2 minutes later, Celeste texted him, and Ava's cloned feed captured the message from a backup device. Julian had carelessly synced to the company cloud. "If she wakes, everything slows down." Julian replied, "She won't wake in time. Celeste answered, "Then Friday is ours." I read those 3 words over and over. Friday is ours. It sounded less like confidence than a confession. Friday was the emergency board meeting. Julian planned to present my alleged incapacity, the forged authorization, and the old will draft as justification for granting him interim control. Celeste had prepared a statement for the press naming him acting chairman. Ellis Crow had a jet reserved that evening to fly to Zurich with encrypted drives and transfer documents. They had timed everything around my silence. That was their final mistake. On Thursday night, Naomi removed my last IV line. I stood in the clinic bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror for the first time without hospital shadows. I was thinner. My face was pale. There were bruises along my arms and a faint yellow mark near my collarbone where Julian's hand had caught me before I fell. But my eyes were my father's eyes, steady and dark and done grieving the wrong thing. Ava brought me a white suit from my closet. "Too dramatic?" she asked. I touched the sleeve. "No," I said. "Appropriate for a resurrection." At dawn on Friday, Marcus spread the evidence across the clinic table in precise stacks. Toxicology, medication substitution, offshore transfers, forged authorization, revised will, my father's recordings, Julian and Celeste's messages, photographs, audit clauses. Naomi placed her notarized medical file on top. Ava added one final envelope, a photo of Celeste leaving Bellamy House at 512 that morning wearing my mother's pearl bracelet. I looked at it for a long moment, surprised by the smallness of what hurt after everything else, not the affair, not even the poison, the bracelet. My mother's bracelet on the wrist of the woman who had stood beside my husband waiting for me to die. Marcus saw my face and said quietly, "We can wait one more day if you need." I shook my head. No. They used my father's funeral as cover. They used my marriage as cover. They used my grief as cover. I closed the folder. Today we take the cover away. Before we left, Naomi checked my pulse and blood pressure one last time. "You are stable," she said, "but adrenaline is not medicine. If you feel dizzy, you sit down. If your chest tightens, you tell me. Revenge is not worth a second collapse." I almost smiled. "This isn't revenge." She raised an eyebrow. "No," I looked toward the window where morning light spread across the clinic courtyard. "Revenge would be wanting them to hurt because I hurt. This is different. I want the truth to arrive while they're still smiling." Naomi studied me for a moment, then nodded. Marcus buttoned his coat. Ava checked the recorder in her bag. Detective Pike waited in an unmarked car 2 blocks from Bellamy headquarters. At 8:15, I stepped outside for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. Charleston smelled like rain salt and spring magnolias. The city thought I was unconscious. Julian thought I was finished. Celeste thought she was about to become queen of a stolen empire. I got into the car and whispered, "Let them start without me." We did not drive straight to Bellamy Harbor headquarters. That was Marcus's decision, and for once I allowed someone else to be cautious on my behalf. The board meeting was scheduled for 10, but Julian had arranged a private pre-meeting at 9 with 3 directors he believed he could bend before the full vote. Marcus wanted him comfortable. Ava wanted him careless. Detective Pike wanted him speaking freely, long enough to establish intent. I wanted to walk through the glass doors immediately and watch the blood leave his face. Instead, we parked in the underground garage of a law office across the street, where Marcus had secured a conference room with a view of Bellamy's top-floor windows. From there, we watched the building wake. Employees crossed the lobby with coffee security guards changed shifts, and on the 42nd floor, lights flickered on in my father's old boardroom. Julian was early. He always was when theft required ceremony. At 8:42, Celeste arrived in a cream coat and oversized sunglasses, the kind of outfit chosen by someone who expected photographers later. Ava zoomed in with her camera from the conference room window. "Pearl bracelet," she said without looking away, still wearing it. I did not answer. The pearls had belonged to my mother before cancer thinned her wrists, and my father locked them away because he could not bear to see them on anyone else. Celeste had not stolen diamonds or gold. She had stolen intimacy, which was uglier. Julian stepped from a black town car 6 minutes later, phone against his ear, face grave enough for cameras and alive enough for victory. He paused beneath the Bellamy Harbor sign, adjusted his cufflinks, and looked up at the building as if measuring where his name might go. Marcus stood beside me. "He believes today ends the uncertainty," he said. I watched Julian disappear inside. "He's right," I said. "Just not in the way he thinks." The cloned company cloud feed gave us Celeste's laptop activity in real time. Marcus had obtained legal emergency access through an internal audit protocol my father wrote years earlier, and because Celeste had used company devices to forge company records, every keystroke now belonged to the investigation. She opened the board packet at 8:55. On the first page, my face appeared beside the words Executive Incapacity Notice. I stared at the photograph they chose. Me at a charity gala 2 years earlier, unsmiling, caught mid-blink. Beneath it, Celeste had written that I was medically compromised, emotionally unstable, and unable to protect shareholder interests. There was a paragraph about my father's death, another about my history of anxiety, and a final recommendation that Julian Hawthorne be granted emergency operational control. Ava read over my shoulder and said, "She writes cruelty like a press release." I felt no heat in my chest, only a clean, cold focus. Print every version, I told Marcus, especially the edits. At 9:03, Julian and Celeste entered the boardroom alone. The audio came through faintly at first, then clearer after Ava adjusted the remote microphone planted by Detective Pike's team during a maintenance sweep the night before. Julian's voice filled our small conference room. "Are we certain Marcus can't block this?" Celeste replied. "He can delay, but once the directors sign emergency authority, we move faster than he can file." Her heels clicked across the floor. "Ellis says the offshore transfer window stays open until 6, Julian exhaled. "Good." There was a pause, paper sliding against wood. Then Celeste said softer, "After today we stop hiding." Julian gave a low laugh. "After today, we can afford better discretion." The sentence landed harder than any love confession could have. Celeste went quiet. Even through the speaker I heard humiliation pass between them. Ava's mouth twisted. "He'll throw her off the boat before he admits he drilled the hole," she said. That was the first crack. We listened as Celeste challenged him, not directly enough to be brave, but sharply enough to be useful. "You told me Evelyn would be gone before the vote," she said. Julian snapped, "She is gone." Celeste answered, "Unconscious isn't gone." A chair shifted. His voice lowered. "Do not lose nerve now." Celeste laughed, once brittle and small. "I lost nerve when she didn't die on the dining room floor." The room around me went still. Marcus wrote the timestamp in his notebook. Detective Pike, listening from the car, murmured through the secure line, "That's admissible if the warrant clears," Julian said. "She drank enough." Celeste shot back, "No, she didn't. You panicked when the housekeeper came in." Silence followed. My hand closed around the edge of the table. There it was, not grief, not misunderstanding, not tragedy. Two people arguing over the technical failure of my murder like a delayed shipment. The private directors arrived before Celeste could say more. Julian transformed instantly. His voice softened, deepened, warmed. I had heard that version of him at charity dinners, at ribbon cuttings, at my father's bedside. He welcomed them with sorrowful dignity, thanked them for coming under painful circumstances, and described my condition with just enough vagueness to let fear do the rest. "Evelyn's doctors are cautious," he said. "We are praying, of course. But the company cannot drift while she remains unreachable." Director Wallace, who had known me since I was 19, asked, "Has she regained consciousness at all?" Julian paused exactly long enough to appear wounded. "Not meaningfully," Celeste added, "and any sudden stimulation could be dangerous according to medical guidance." Naomi, standing beside me with headphones on, muttered, "I never said that." Julian continued, "Thomas trusted me to protect this family." I looked toward my father's building across the street. "No," I whispered. "He trusted me to expose you." At 9:27, Marcus received a message from Detective Pike. "Warrant approved. Digital capture active. Financial crimes team inbound." Marcus looked at me. "We can proceed when you are ready." Ready was a strange word. I had been ready when I tasted bitterness in the wine. I had been ready when Julian placed the glass in my hand. I had been ready when my father's voice came from a hidden chip, telling me my marriage had become a crime scene. Still, my legs trembled slightly when I stood. Naomi saw it. "Sit if you need another minute." I shook my head. "If I sit, I'll start feeling." Ava handed me my coat. "And if you feel," she asked. I buttoned it slowly. "Then I'll still walk." We took the service elevator down, crossed through the garage tunnel, and entered Bellamy Harbor Group through the side security entrance my father used when he wanted to avoid donors. The guard at the desk looked at me and dropped his pen. His name was Samuel, and he had worked nights at Bellamy Harbor since before I graduated college. For 3 seconds he stared as if the dead had learned to wear white suits. Then he stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. "Miss Bellamy," he whispered. Marcus stepped forward, voice low. "Not a word yet, Sam." Samuel swallowed hard, eyes shining. "Yes, sir." He scanned us through without logging my name using Marcus's legal access badge. As we crossed the private corridor toward the executive elevators, I saw my reflection in the dark, glass-pale face, straight shoulders, my mother's diamond studs, my father's watch chain looped at my waist. I did not look resurrected. I looked unfinished, which was better. Finished things can be buried. Unfinished things return. In the elevator, Ava checked her recorder. Naomi checked my pulse from habit. Marcus reviewed the documents. No one said anything. The numbers climbed 18243-142. Each floor felt like a year of my marriage peeling away. The elevator opened into the executive lobby, and Celeste's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, stood from his desk with a gasp. Behind him, the wall that once displayed my father's portrait now held a framed photograph of Julian shaking hands with the mayor. I stopped walking. "When did that go up?" I asked. Peter's mouth opened and closed. "Yesterday, ma'am. Yesterday. Before the board had voted. Before legal authority had changed. Julian had already replaced the dead man whose company he was stealing." Marcus's face hardened. "Photograph it," he told Ava. "She did," Peter whispered. "They said you couldn't wake up." I looked at him. People say many things when they need silence to be true. From inside the boardroom, Julian's voice rose, warm and rehearsed. "This is not about ambition. This is about stewardship." Ava almost laughed. I walked toward the double doors before Marcus could ask if I was ready again. I did not enter yet. Instead, I stood outside and listened. Julian was reaching the emotional center of his speech. "My wife is the love of my life," he said, and the sentence touched nothing inside me. But love cannot blind us to responsibility. Thomas built Bellamy Harbor with discipline, and I believe he would want continuity. A director asked, "What does Marcus Reed say about the updated will?" Celeste answered too quickly. "The controlling draft is in the packet." Marcus leaned close to me and whispered, "False." Julian said Evelyn signed authorization before the incident. She understood the need for stability. The incident, not poisoning, not collapse, not attempted murder. The incident. My fingers found the cold curve of my father's watch. Behind me, Detective Pike and 2 financial crimes agents stepped from the stairwell, silent and ready. Marcus nodded once. That was the signal. I placed my hand on the brass handle my father had polished every Monday morning with a handkerchief, because he trusted rituals more than luck. When the doors opened, the room did not go silent immediately. That was what surprised me. Julian continued speaking for half a sentence because he was too committed to his performance to notice death walking in. Then Director Wallace looked past him, his face draining of color. Celeste saw Wallace's expression first. She turned and the folder slipped from her hands, pages sliding across the floor. Julian stopped mid-word. His mouth opened slightly. For one bright, terrible second, the mask vanished, and I saw the raw thought before he buried it impossible. I stepped into the boardroom. Rain clouds pressed against the windows behind the long table, turning the harbor beyond into a sheet of gray steel. "Forgive the interruption," I said. My voice sounded calm even to me. I was told this meeting concerned my incapacity. Julian gripped the back of his chair. "Evelyn," he breathed. "You're supposed to be." He stopped. I tilted my head. Dead. The room did not move. Celeste recovered first because panic made her faster than guilt. "Evelyn, thank God," she said, taking one step toward me with both hands raised. "We were so worried." I looked at the pearls on her wrist, my mother's pearls glowing softly against her skin. "Take off the bracelet," I said. The sentence struck harder than if I had accused her of murder. Her hand flew instinctively to her wrist. Julian found his voice. "This is medically reckless. You shouldn't be here." Naomi entered behind me. Her physician disagrees. Julian's eyes flashed toward Naomi with something close to hatred. Marcus placed the revised will on the table. Ava stood near the wall, recording openly now. Detective Pike remained by the door. The directors looked from Julian to me, confusion slowly bending into fear. I walked to the head of the table, the chair my father had occupied for 30 years and did not sit. "Before anyone signs anything," I said, "you should know my husband tried to kill me." Julian laughed. It was the wrong response, too quick and too loud. "This is absurd," he said, spreading his hands. "She's clearly not well. Naomi, what have you done? She should be in a hospital." I placed the toxicology report on the table. "Aconitine was found in my blood and in the wine poured for me after my father's funeral," Naomi added. The concentration was medically consistent with deliberate poisoning, Celeste whispered. No. I turned toward her. You said the same thing when I didn't die fast enough. Her face emptied. Julian's voice sharpened. Careful, Evelyn. Grief can distort memory. I placed the medication report beside the toxicology file. My medication was substituted 5 days before my father died. Enough to make the wine more lethal. Enough to make my death look natural. Director Wallace rose slowly. Julian, what is this? Julian kept his eyes on me. A breakdown, he said. A tragic public breakdown. Then Marcus pressed play on the first recording. Celeste's voice filled the boardroom from the speaker on Ava's phone. I lost nerve when she didn't die on the dining room floor. Julian's followed. She drank enough. No one breathed. Celeste made a small sound, half sob, half denial. Julian turned toward her so sharply the chair behind him scraped the floor. What did you say? He demanded, as if the recording were her betrayal instead of his confession. Marcus played the next clip. If she wakes, everything slows down. Then the next, Friday is ours. The directors stared at Julian now, not as a grieving husband, but as a liability with a pulse. He reached for his phone. Detective Pike stepped forward. Mr. Hawthorne placed the phone on the table. Julian's jaw tightened. Do you know who I am? Pike's expression did not change. Yes, that's why I'm here. Celeste began crying then, but quietly, carefully, still trying to choose a role that might save her. The offshore transfers came next. Marcus projected them onto the boardroom screen. Vendor shells, false invoices, approvals bearing Julian's digital signature, Celeste's administrative entries, Ellis Crow's holding company, the 6 o'clock transfer, window. My father's video played after that. His face appeared above the table, pale but steady, and several directors lowered their eyes as if he had walked into the room himself. Julian is not who he pretends to be, my father said from the screen. Do not confront them without proof. Julian's face had gone gray. Celeste stared at the carpet, tears sliding down her cheeks. When the video ended, I placed the revised will at the center of the table. This is the controlling document, I said. If I died, disappeared, or became incapacitated within 60 days of my father's death, all controlling shares froze pending forensic audit. Julian never had authority. He only had motive. Director Wallace looked at Marcus. Is this valid? Marcus replied. Fully executed, witnessed, and notarized. Thomas Bellamy anticipated fraud. I looked at Julian. He anticipated you. That was when Julian turned on Celeste. Not with rage at the crime, but with rage at being caught. You stupid girl, he hissed. Celeste looked up as if he had slapped her. Me, she said. Her voice cracked open. You bought it. You told me the dosage. You told me Naomi could be managed. Julian lunged verbally, not physically. You forged the signatures. Celeste stood shaking now. Because you said I would have a seat at the table. He laughed, ugly and bare. You were never getting a seat. You were a secretary with access. The room watched their affair become evidence. Celeste's tears stopped. Something in her hardened. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small silver drive, and threw it onto the table. Then enjoy what your secretary saved, she said. Detective Pike picked it up with a gloved hand. Julian stared at it as if it were a loaded gun. I almost thanked him for teaching her betrayal so well. Instead, I said nothing. Silence was more useful. Pike read the arrest warrants in a voice that made every word feel nailed to the floor. Julian Hawthorne was arrested for attempted murder, conspiracy, financial fraud, identity theft, and evidence tampering. Celeste Vale was arrested for conspiracy, attempted murder, digital forgery, and unlawful access to protected medical and corporate records. Julian kept insisting this was a misunderstanding until Pike cuffed him. Celeste did not resist. As the agents led her past me, she stopped just long enough to unclasp my mother's pearl bracelet with trembling fingers and place it on the table. I didn't think you would come back, she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. That was the second mistake. Julian struggled only once near the doorway when he looked back at the directors and realized no one was standing to defend him. Not one ally. Not one borrowed mourner. Not one person willing to mistake his performance for truth now that the lights were on. After they were taken away, the boardroom remained unnaturally quiet. Papers lay scattered where Celeste had dropped them. The projected image of offshore transfers still glowed on the screen. My father's chair waited behind me. Director Wallace cleared his throat. "Evelyn," he said softly, "what do you need from us?" It was the first honest question anyone in that building had asked me since my father died. I looked around the room at the people who had nearly signed away my company because my husband made my pain sound inconvenient. Anger could have answered, so could humiliation. Instead, I heard my father's voice discipline before reaction. "You will cooperate fully with the forensic audit," I said. "You will suspend all pending transfers. You will reinstate Marcus Reed as lead counsel on all succession matters. And no one in this room will ever again confuse a woman's grief with incompetence." Wallace lowered his head. "Understood." I finally sat in my father's chair, not because I wanted the throne but because someone had to stop the bleeding. By the time I left Bellamy Harbor, headquarters reporters had already gathered outside. News moved quickly when Betrayal wore a good suit. Cameras flashed as I stepped through the front doors with Naomi on one side and Marcus on the other. Questions crashed over me. "Mrs. Hawthorne, were you poisoned? Is your husband under arrest? Are you taking control of Bellamy Harbor?" I stopped at the top of the steps and looked out over the wet street. The same city that had pitied me that morning as a broken heiress. "My father built this company on trust," I said. "Today we began removing those who abused it. That was all." Ava later told me it was the perfect statement. I did not care if it was perfect. I cared that it was mine. As we walked to the car, I touched my mother's bracelet, now back around my wrist, and felt the smallest shift inside me. Not peace, not yet, but the first clean edge of it. That night I returned to Bellamy House for the first time since Julian had poured the wine. The dining room smelled of lemon polish and old wood, but beneath it my mind still supplied the bitter scent that had risen from the glass. The chair I had fallen beside had been moved back into place. The floor had been cleaned. Nothing visible remained, which made the room feel more dangerous than if blood had stained it. Naomi wanted me to stay elsewhere. Marcus offered his guest house. Ava offered her couch and a baseball bat. I thanked them and refused. "This is my house," I said. After they left, I stood alone under the chandelier. Rain tapped the windows. The same table waited, polished and silent. I opened the cellar cabinet, removed the remaining bottles from that shelf, and placed my father's pocket watch in the empty space. Julian had used grief as cover. Celeste had used sympathy as costume. My father had used time as a weapon. 3 weeks had passed. Tomorrow, the world would call it a scandal. I knew better. It was a resurrection with evidence. The first thing Julian did from holding was ask for a private doctor. The second thing he did was ask if I had made a statement. That told Detective Pike more about his priorities than any confession could have. A man falsely accused of trying to murder his wife might ask whether she was alive, whether she was safe, whether the poison had left lasting damage. Julian wanted to know what I had said and how many people had heard it. Celeste, by contrast, asked for a lawyer and then cried so hard the booking officer had to bring tissues. Ava told me this over coffee the next morning, while 3 news vans waited beyond the front gates of Bellamy House. My husband's arrest had turned Charleston into a theater of shocked whispers. People who had embraced him at my father's funeral now appeared on television saying they always sensed something cold beneath his charm. I watched none of it for long. Public memory is a coward. It flatters whoever survived with evidence. By noon, Julian's legal team released a statement calling the allegations a tragic misunderstanding fueled by grief, medication, and corporate rivalry. I read the sentence twice, not because it surprised me, but because cruelty often hides in grammar. They placed grief first, medication second, rivalry third. Poison was not mentioned. Celeste was described as an administrative employee whose conduct is still under review, which meant Julian had begun pushing her toward the center of the fire. Marcus sat across from me in my father's study, his tie loosened for the first time in years. "He will argue you were unstable, that the recordings were taken out of context, that Celeste acted independently, and that the financial transfers were aggressive restructuring." I looked at the folders stacked between us, and Celeste Marcus's mouth tightened. "If she is smart, she will trade him for oxygen." Outside, the reporters shouted whenever a car slowed near the gate. Inside, my father's clock ticked steadily, indifferent to scandal. Celeste became smart by sunset. Her attorney contacted Detective Pike and requested a proffer session with federal financial investigators present. Marcus told me before the news leaked because he believed I deserved to hear the shape of the betrayal before strangers polished it for headlines. Celeste admitted she forged my signature on internal authorization forms. She admitted she altered medical summaries using information Julian had provided. She admitted she had been in Bellamy House the afternoon before my father's funeral and had accessed the wine cellar under Julian's instruction, but when asked who introduced the toxin, she hesitated. "He mixed it," she said finally. "I resealed the bottle." Pike later told Marcus that Julian had purchased the compound through a specialty botanical supplier using a consulting company tied to Ellis Crow. Celeste had kept invoices, screenshots, and one audio clip Julian did not know existed. In it, his voice was clear. "If she dies at home, grief explains everything. If she survives, we move before she speaks." I listened to that recording once, then asked Marcus to turn it off. The arraignment happened 2 days later in federal court because the financial crimes crossed state lines and the attempted asset transfer had involved offshore accounts. Julian entered wearing a navy suit, no handcuffs visible from the gallery, his hair combed, his jaw clean-shaven, his expression composed enough to offend me. Celeste sat at a separate defense table in a gray blouse that made her look younger and smaller than she had ever looked in my father's office. They did not look at each other. That was the first satisfying thing about the hearing. Betrayal had stripped them of romance faster than guilt ever could. The judge read the charges slowly. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder by poisoning, wire fraud, identity theft, falsification of medical records, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, attempted unlawful transfer of corporate assets. Julian pleaded not guilty. His attorney said, "My client loved his wife and acted only to protect a family enterprise during a medical emergency." I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine, though this time it was not Ethan from the source of another life. It was Marcus beside me, steady and silent, reminding me not to answer lies spoken in court. I did not speak to Julian that day, but he tried to speak to me. As marshals escorted him past the aisle, he turned his head just enough for his voice to reach me. "Evelyn, don't let them turn this into something it wasn't." I looked at him for the first time since the boardroom. Without his office, his watch, his cameras, his borrowed grief, he seemed smaller, though not weaker. Julian's danger had never been volume. It had been precision. "You poured the wine," I said. His eyes flickered. "You drank it." The answer was so revealing I almost thanked him. Even now he framed my survival as participation in his crime. Celeste heard him and let out a short, broken laugh from her side of the aisle. Julian's face hardened, and for 1 second I saw the man she had discovered too late, not a lover, not a partner, but a strategist who resented every witness he failed to control. The marshals moved him forward before he could say more. The trial did not begin for months, but the public unraveling began immediately. Bellamy Harbor froze Julian's accounts pending audit. The board suspended every contract he had touched. Ellis Crow disappeared for 36 hours, then reappeared in Miami with federal agents at his hotel door. Ava published a restrained piece because I asked her not to turn my life into spectacle, but restraint can be sharper than outrage. Her headline was simple: "Bellamy Harbor attempted transfer blocked by founder's final safeguard." The article did not call me fragile. It did not call Julian charming. It laid out dates, filings, signatures, and the revised will my father had executed before his death. By the next morning, investors who had privately encouraged Julian's smooth transition began calling Marcus to express relief that I had returned. Marcus placed those messages into a separate folder labeled "Cowards." I laughed for the first time in weeks when I saw it. The sound startled me. It did not feel happy. It felt like proof that my body still knew how to release pressure without breaking. But the hardest evidence did not come from banks or devices. It came from my father's last nurse, a woman named Delia Price, who had worked night shifts during his final month. Delia called Marcus after seeing Julian on television deny everything with polished sorrow. She came to Bellamy House wearing a brown coat and holding a plastic grocery bag full of folded notes. "Mr. Bellamy asked me to write down visitors," she said, sitting stiffly on the edge of the study chair. "He said if anything ever felt off, details matter. Details matter." I heard my father in the sentence. Delia's notes showed that Celeste visited Thomas twice without logging through the main entrance. Julian had brought her in through the garden door. On the second visit, Thomas became agitated afterward and asked Delia whether Evelyn had changed pharmacies. Delia also remembered hearing Julian say in the hallway, "She's more useful grieving than managing." The words settled over the room like ash. My father had heard enough to fear for me before his heart gave out. The prosecution used Delia's notes to pressure Julian's team. Celeste used them to save herself further. Within a week, she agreed to testify against Julian in exchange for reduced sentencing consideration, though not immunity. Her statement filled 48 pages. I read only parts of it because some truths are useful without being survivable in full. Julian had begun discussing my inevitable collapse before my father died. He told Celeste that widowed daughters often made emotional decisions after patriarchal loss, and if my collapse happened close enough to the funeral, no one would distinguish sorrow from illness. He had studied my medications, my stress levels, my schedule, and my loyalty to family rituals. He chose the night after the funeral because he knew I would return to Bellamy House exhausted, hungry, and unwilling to make a scene in front of staff. Celeste wrote one sentence that stayed with me. He said grief would do half the work. I closed the file after that and walked outside until the salt air stopped tasting like metal. When the trial finally began, Charleston had already chosen sides, but the courtroom did not care about whispers. It cared about sequence. The prosecutor, Maren Holt, understood that. She did not begin with poison. She began with my father. She showed the jury Bellamy Harbor as it had been before Julian touched it, a family company, complicated but solvent, built over decades. Then she showed the missing money. Then the fake vendor accounts. Then Celeste's forged edits. Only after the financial motive was clear did she introduce the wine. A murder plan without money is rage, Maren told the jury in opening statements. A financial plan with poison is calculation. Julian sat still, hands folded, eyes lowered at exactly the angle grief photographers love. Celeste avoided looking at me when she entered as a cooperating witness. I did not blame her for that. Looking at me required seeing the person she had reduced to an obstacle. Some people can confess crimes more easily than they can face the humanity of their target. Naomi testified first about the toxicology and medication substitution. She explained how the wrong tablets would amplify the poison's effects, how the symptoms could mimic a cardiac collapse, and how Julian's insistence on my supposed instability had raised her suspicion. Julian's attorney tried to imply she disliked him. Naomi replied, "I dislike inaccurate medical histories presented by people who benefit from them." The courtroom murmured, and the judge instructed silence. Marcus testified about the forged authorization, the revised will, and my father's safeguard clause. When Julian's attorney suggested Thomas Bellamy had been paranoid near death, Marcus removed his glasses and said Thomas Bellamy was cautious, not paranoid. The distinction is currently on trial. Even the judge looked down to hide something like a smile. Then Delia testified. Her voice shook at first, but it steadied when she described Thomas asking whether my pharmacy had changed. He was worried about his daughter, she said, not the company, his daughter. Celeste testified on the fourth day. She looked thinner, less polished, her hair pulled back without the shine she once wore like armor. The prosecutor asked when her relationship with Julian began. 11 months before Mr. Bellamy died, she said. Asked when the plan began, she swallowed. Financially, months before. The poisoning 6 weeks before. The jury shifted. Maren asked who suggested poison. Celeste closed her eyes briefly. Julian. His attorney objected, but the foundation held. Celeste described the supplier, the resealed bottle, the forged medical narrative, the prepared press statement, the emergency board packet. When asked why she participated, she said, "Because I thought he loved me, and because he promised me a future." Maren paused. A future that required Evelyn Hawthorne to die. Celeste's mouth trembled. Yes, Julian stared straight ahead. He never once looked at her. That was when I understood the final truth of their affair. He had never loved Celeste either. He had only loved access. Julian chose not to testify. His defense leaned on doubt, ambition, and my supposed fragility. They claimed Celeste acted out of jealousy. They claimed Julian was guilty only of poor judgment and concealed financial pressure. They suggested I had staged my return dramatically to regain control of the company as if being poisoned were a publicity strategy. The prosecutor answered with recordings. The boardroom audio played again. I lost nerve when she didn't die on the dining room floor. She drank enough. Then Julian's private recording. If she dies at home, grief explains everything. The jury did not move while those words filled the courtroom. I watched Julian's face as his own voice stripped him bare. He blinked slowly, jaw tight, still searching for a way to make language obey him. For years he had survived by naming things before others could. Concern, stability, protection, grief. But evidence had renamed everything. Concern became control. Stability became theft. Protection became poison. Grief became cover. The verdict came after 11 hours of deliberation. I sat in the second row with Marcus on one side and Ava on the other. Naomi was behind me. Delia sat quietly near the aisle. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and winter coats. Julian stood when the jury entered, shoulders squared, face unreadable. Celeste had already entered a separate plea and would be sentenced later, but she was present under guard to hear the outcome of the man she had followed into ruin. The foreperson read the verdict count by count. Conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. Attempted murder by poisoning, guilty. Wire fraud, guilty. Identity theft, guilty. Falsification of medical records, guilty. Attempted unlawful transfer of corporate assets, guilty. Each word landed with the dull force of a door closing. Julian did not collapse. He did not shout. He turned his head slightly toward me, and for the first time I saw fear without performance. Not fear of prison. Fear that the story now belonged to someone else. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later, almost exactly 2 months after the funeral. Julian received 32 years. Celeste received 12 after cooperation, still long enough to understand that borrowed pearls can become chains. Ellis Crow's case continued separately, widening into a financial crimes investigation that reached people Julian had once called friends. When the judge asked whether I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood. My paper trembled only once before I folded it and spoke without reading. "You did not just try to end my life," I said, looking at Julian. "You tried to edit it. You tried to make my grief look like weakness, my medicine look like instability, my silence look like consent, and my father's legacy look like yours. You failed, because truth does not need to be louder than lies. It only needs to survive long enough to be heard." Julian looked away before I finished. That was the closest thing to satisfaction I allowed myself. After court reporters waited on the steps again, this time I did not stop. Ava handled them with one sentence: "Mrs. Hawthorne has said everything necessary under oath." Bellamy House was quiet when I returned. The gate opened slowly, the driveway curved beneath oaks, dripping with Spanish moss, and for the first time since my father died, the house did not look like a crime scene from the outside. It looked tired. So was I. Inside, I walked straight to the dining room. The chandelier was clean, the table shone, the chair was aligned. On the sideboard sat one unopened bottle from my father's cellar, same vineyard, same vintage as the one Julian had used. Marcus had suggested destroying the entire collection, but that felt like giving Julian ownership over everything the cellar had meant before him. I picked up the bottle, carried it to the kitchen sink, and cut the seal. The cork came free with a soft, ordinary sound. For a moment the smell rose rich and dark, and my body remembered fear. I poured the wine slowly down the drain. It spread red against the stainless steel, then thinned under the running water until nothing remained but the faint scent of grapes and oak. I did not pour it out because wine had become evil. I poured it out because one bottle deserved to end where the lie began. Naomi once told me the body keeps score even when the mind argues. As the last of the wine disappeared, my shoulders dropped in a way I had not felt in months. I washed the sink, dried my hands, and returned to the cellar cabinet. My father's pocket watch still rested on the empty shelf. I picked it up and closed my fingers around it. "You were right," I whispered, though I wished desperately that he had never needed to be. Then I locked the cabinet, not to preserve fear, but to mark the boundary between what happened there and what would happen next. Julian had wanted my father's house to swallow me. Instead, it had kept the evidence until I could stand. That night I slept in my childhood room instead of the master bedroom Julian and I had shared. The wallpaper was outdated, the window stuck slightly when I tried to open it, and one shelf still held paperbacks I had read at 16. It felt honest in a way the master bedroom no longer did. Before turning off the lamp, I opened my notebook and wrote 3 sentences. "Grief is not weakness. Love without loyalty is performance. Survival is not revenge, but it can become justice." I read them once, then closed the notebook. Outside Charleston, rain moved softly through the oaks. Somewhere beyond the city, Julian was beginning the first night of a sentence long enough to outlast his charm. Celeste was learning what promises made by hungry men are worth, and I was breathing in a house they had tried to steal from a dead man and a living woman. Tomorrow there would be company audits, legal repairs, headlines, and statements, but tonight there was only quiet, and for the first time, quiet did not feel like waiting for danger. It felt like mine. Spring arrived late in Charleston that year, as if even the weather needed time to believe the worst had passed. For weeks after Julian's sentencing, Bellamy House remained full of people carrying clipboards, legal folders, security equipment, and careful sympathy. Auditors came and went through the side entrance. Marcus spent long afternoons in my father's study correcting ownership records and unwinding every false transfer Julian had touched. Ava published one final investigation about the shell companies, then stopped writing about me because she understood that survival is not public property. Naomi visited every Tuesday to check my blood pressure, though we both knew she was checking more than numbers. "Your pulse is better," she said one morning, wrapping the cuff around my arm. "So is your color." I looked toward the dining room where sunlight now fell across the table instead of ambulance lights. "I still hear the glass sometimes," I admitted. Naomi nodded, not surprised. "Then let it be a sound, not a sentence." Bellamy Harbor did not collapse without Julian, which seemed to shock everyone except the people who had done the actual work for years. The board offered apologies in different forms. Wallace wrote a long letter. 2 directors resigned before I could ask them to. One sent white orchids to the house with a card that said, "We should have trusted you." I threw the card away and gave the orchids to Naomi's clinic. Trust offered after evidence is not trust, it is adjustment. At my first full meeting as acting chair, I sat in my father's seat without pretending it did not hurt. The room had been rearranged since the arrests. Julian's framed photograph was gone from the executive lobby. My father's portrait had been restored, but I asked facilities to move it from behind the board table to the side wall. "He built this," Wallace said carefully. "Yes," I replied, "but I need to lead without sitting in his shadow." No one argued. They were still learning what my voice sounded like when it did not ask permission. The forensic audit uncovered more than we expected and less than I feared. Julian had stolen aggressively, but not intelligently enough to outrun a dead man's safeguards. My father's audit triggers had frozen several transfers before the money left domestic accounts. Ellis Crow's testimony helped recover another portion. Some losses remained permanent, but money, I had learned, is not the most expensive thing a thief can take. Reputation returned slowly, sleep returned slower. For months, I woke before dawn and walked through the house, checking doors once, then twice, then once again, because the second time angered me. Eventually the habit softened. I stopped pausing outside the wine cellar. I stopped flinching when someone set a glass down too hard. I stopped reading every headline that mentioned my name. The world wanted a clean ending. Poisoned heiress survives, husband imprisoned, fortune restored. Real endings are messier. They happen in the body first. In the morning, you realize you made coffee without remembering who tried to kill you. Celeste wrote me once from prison. The envelope arrived on a humid afternoon, thin and pale, with her name printed in block letters as if handwriting might reveal too much. I opened it in the study with Marcus present, not because I feared her, but because I no longer allowed anyone connected to Julian to enter my life unobserved. The letter was 4 pages long. She apologized for letting ambition blind her, for believing Julian's lies, for standing too close to a life that was never hers. She wrote that she still dreamed of the moment I walked into the boardroom in white. "I thought ghosts came to punish," she wrote, "but you looked alive, and that was worse." At the end, she asked whether I could ever forgive her. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an evidence box, not in my keepsake drawer. Forgiveness is not a court order. It does not arrive because the guilty request a lighter room inside themselves. Julian never wrote. That was one of the few mercies he gave me, though I doubt mercy was his intention. Through his appeals, I heard his voice only in legal filings. He claimed prejudice, improper evidence, medical confusion, emotional manipulation by Celeste bias from my father's attorney, and the theatrical reappearance of the alleged victim. Marcus read that phrase aloud once, and then apologized immediately. I surprised us both by laughing, not because it was funny, but because Julian was still trying to do the same thing from a prison cell that he had tried to do beside my hospital bed, rename reality until it served him. His appeal failed. Then another motion failed. After that, his name began to appear less often in my inbox. A person like Julian fears obscurity more than hatred. Hatred keeps him central. Obscurity makes him ordinary. So I let him become ordinary, a case number behind concrete walls. A man whose charm had finally met paperwork it could not seduce. One afternoon in May, I opened the wine cellar for the first time without preparing myself. The air inside was cool and still carrying dust, oak, and memory. My father's pocket watch remained on the shelf where I had placed it, a small gold moon in the dim light. I took it outside to the back garden and sat beneath the magnolia tree my mother had planted when I was 12. The watch clicked open smoothly. The hidden compartment was empty now. Every file had been copied, submitted, and archived. Without the chip, it was just a watch again. That realization hurt in a gentle way. I held it against my palm and thought about my father alone in his study recording warnings while illness hollowed him out. I had spent months grieving the danger he anticipated. That day, for the first time, I grieved, simply because he was gone. Not as a witness, not as a protector, as my father. The man who remembered I hated raisins in bread pudding and pretended not to notice when I cried during old war movies. I created the Thomas Bellamy Justice Fund at the end of that month. Marcus suggested a scholarship. Wallace suggested a business ethics chair at the university. Both were respectable ideas, which meant they were too easy. I wanted something closer to the wound. The fund would provide legal and financial assistance to people trapped by intimate fraud spouses whose accounts had been drained, elderly parents manipulated into signing property-away partners whose medication records or mental health histories had been weaponized against them. At the launch meeting, a young woman from a shelter asked why someone with my resources cared about cases like hers. The question was honest, not cruel. I answered honestly, because control often wears the face of love before it shows its teeth. The room went quiet. I did not tell them about the taste of the wine or the sound of Celeste's voice asking how long before it looked natural. I did not need to. Some truths translate without detail. Ava insisted I give one interview not to feed the scandal but to end the version of me the scandal had created. We filmed it at Bellamy Harbor just after sunrise with the marina behind me and the water turning gold under the first light. She asked about my father, the company, the trial, and the moment I walked into the boardroom. I answered what I could. Then she asked, "Do you consider what happened revenge?" I looked past the camera toward the docks where my father once taught me to tie a cleat hitch with cold fingers and endless patience. "No," I said. "Revenge would have meant making them suffer because I suffered. What happened was accountability. There is a difference. Accountability returns reality to the room." Ava lowered the question sheet slightly, her eyes bright. "And survival?" she asked. I thought of the floor, the glass, the monitors, the hidden chip, the boardroom doors opening. "Survival is not the end of the story," I said. "It is the first page you get to write yourself." The interview aired on a Sunday evening. I did not watch it live. Instead, I invited Naomi, Marcus, Ava, Delia, and a few old employees from Bellamy Harbor to dinner at the house. We ate on the back terrace because the weather was warm and the garden smelled of magnolia and rain. No wine was served, not because I banned it forever, but because no one needed it that night. We drank tea, coffee, sparkling water, and one terrible lemonade Ava made too strong. Delia told a story about my father refusing to eat hospital pudding unless someone called it custard. Marcus laughed so hard he had to remove his glasses. Naomi corrected everyone's posture, then denied doing it. For the first time since the funeral, Bellamy House held voices that did not feel like intrusion. After they left, I walked through the dining room and paused beside the chair where I had fallen. The memory was still there, but it no longer owned the room. Memory had become furniture, present-shaped but not alive enough to chase me. Near midnight, I carried my father's pocket watch upstairs and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, instead of returning it to the cellar. The battlefield was closed. The watch did not need to guard the scene anymore. I opened my notebook and reread the sentences I had written after sentencing. Grief is not weakness. Love without loyalty is performance. Survival is not revenge, but it can become justice. Under them I wrote one more. Peace is what remains when truth no longer has to shout. Then I sat by the window and listened to the house settle. Old houses speak at night, and Bellamy House had always been restless, pipes ticking wood, shifting wind, pressing against shutters from the harbor. For months I had mistaken every sound for threat. Now the sounds returned to being ordinary. A branch tapped the glass. Somewhere downstairs the refrigerator hummed. The world did not become safe all at once. Safety returned like tide water, inch by inch, covering what had been exposed. The final legal document arrived in June. It restored my name fully, Evelyn Bellamy, not Evelyn Hawthorne, on all corporate records, property deeds, bank authorities, and trust instruments. I had kept Julian's surname through marriage because changing it had once seemed symbolic in a romantic, harmless way. After the trial, keeping it felt like carrying a label attached by someone who had tried to erase me. I signed the last page in Marcus's office with my father's fountain pen. Marcus blotted the ink and smiled faintly. "Welcome back, Miss Bellamy." The words settled deeper than I expected. Back was not exactly right. The woman who signed that page was not the woman who stood at the funeral in black, letting her husband guide her through condolences. She was not the woman who tasted bitter wine and tried to make sense of betrayal before her body failed. She was someone built from both of them, scarred and awake. "Thank you," I said, and for once the phrase was enough. That evening I went alone to the cemetery. Summer heat lingered over the grass, and the marble of my father's headstone felt warm beneath my hand. I told him about the fund, the audit, the restored company, the moved portrait, the watch by my bed. I told him Julian's appeal had failed and Celeste had written. I told him I had started sleeping through most nights. Then I stood there quietly because the most important things had no clean sentences. I wanted to tell him I was angry he had not warned me sooner, and grateful he had warned me at all. I wanted to tell him that being protected by a dead man hurts because you cannot thank him properly. Instead, I said, "I'm still here." The wind moved through the oak trees, lifting the edges of the flowers someone had left nearby. It was not an answer, but it was enough. Sometimes enough is the kindest form of closure life offers. When I returned home, I opened every curtain on the first floor. The sunset entered room by room, turning polished wood, amber, and dust motes gold. I stood in the dining room last. For a moment I could see all versions of that room layered together. My father carving roast at Christmas, my mother laughing with pearls at her throat, Julian holding out the glass, Celeste gripping the folder, paramedics rushing through rain, me returning alone to pour one bottle down the sink. Then the images separated and the present remained. A table, chairs, light. I set fresh flowers in the center, white magnolias from the garden, and let them be simple. Not memorial, not evidence, just flowers. That was when I understood the real ending had not been the verdict or the sentencing or the restored assets. The real ending was the moment a room where someone tried to kill me could become a room where flowers looked ordinary again. I never remarried quickly, though people expected that kind of epilogue from a woman betrayed by a handsome villain. Healing is not a casting call. I rebuilt slowly. I learned the company from the inside out in ways Julian never had patience for. I met employees my father knew by name and discovered which systems had survived because quiet people refused to cut corners. I took Naomi's advice and saw a trauma therapist who did not let me hide behind competence. I let Ava drag me to terrible movies. I let Marcus teach me how to read trust language without hearing Julian's voice in every clause. Some days were clean, some days were not, but even the bad days belonged to me. That mattered more than anyone outside would understand. When someone tries to turn your life into an asset, reclaiming ordinary choices becomes sacred. What to eat, who to trust, which door to lock, when to rest, whether to answer a letter, whether to let silence stay silent. A year after the funeral, Bellamy Harbor opened the first legal clinic funded by my father's trust. Delia cut the ribbon because I asked her to. She cried, then cursed me for making her cry in public. The first clients arrived that same afternoon. A widower whose stepchildren had emptied his accounts, a young mother whose husband had forged her signature on loans, an elderly woman whose nephew had isolated her from her doctor, lawyer. Their stories were different from mine, but the architecture was familiar. Charm, pressure, paperwork, isolation, a narrative prepared in advance. I listened to them and felt something inside me settle into purpose. Pain that only remains, pain can rot. Pain given structure can become shelter. My father had built harbors for boats. I could build one for people trying to escape storms that began inside their own homes. That finally felt like inheritance. On the anniversary night, I did not visit the courtroom records or reread the verdict. I went to the wine cellar instead. I opened the cabinet, selected one of my father's best bottles, and carried it upstairs. Naomi would have raised an eyebrow if she had seen me. Ava would have made a joke. Marcus would have pretended not to worry. I set the bottle on the dining table and looked at it for a long time. Then I opened it, poured one glass, and let it breathe. I did not drink immediately. I lifted the glass and smelled oak, blackberry, earth thyme. No bitterness, no metallic edge, no hand at my wrist pretending concern, only wine. I took one small sip and closed my eyes. My heartbeat stayed steady. The house stayed quiet. The room stayed mine. That sip was not defiance, it was reclamation. Julian had tried to make a glass of wine the end of my story. I made it evidence that the story had moved on. If you ask whether I forgive them, I will tell you the truth. I do not organize my life around that question anymore. Julian is serving his sentence. Celeste is serving hers. Their names live in court records, archived articles, and places I no longer visit without reason. My father's name lives on buildings, legal clinics, scholarship letters, and the watch beside my bed. My mother's pearls stay in a small velvet box until I choose to wear them, not as proof that Celeste failed to steal them, but because they were beautiful before the crime and remained beautiful after it. That distinction matters. Evil does not get permanent ownership of what it touches. Betrayal can stain, but it cannot define unless you keep kneeling before it. I stood up once because my body refused to die. I kept standing because truth gave me ground. Everything after that was a choice made one breath at a time. So this is what I remember most clearly now, not the poison, not the courtroom, not Julian's face when the jury read guilty. I remember the morning after the final papers were signed, standing on the porch of Bellamy House, while the harbor fog lifted and sunlight touched the water. The world looked ordinary, almost indifferent. Birds moved through the magnolia branches, a delivery truck passed the gate. Somewhere in the city, people were late for work, burning toast, spilling coffee, kissing children goodbye. Life had not paused for my betrayal, and at first that had offended me. Then it comforted me. The world continuing meant I could continue too. 3 weeks after my father's funeral, I walked back into a boardroom and took my life out of the hands of people who thought I was already gone. But the real return took longer. It happened quietly in rooms where fear became memory, where memory became lesson, and where lesson finally became freedom. Julian once told the board that love could not blind us to responsibility. It was one of the few true sentences he ever spoke, though not in the way he meant. Love for my father could not blind me to what had been done in his name. Love for my marriage could not blind me to the man who had poisoned it long before he poisoned the wine. Love for peace could not require silence. Responsibility meant standing up when every lie around me depended on my staying down. It meant letting my grief be real without letting it be used against me. It meant accepting that family, marriage, and loyalty are sacred only when they are mutual. Without truth, they are costumes. Without accountability, they are cages. I had lived inside both. I chose the door. That night, after the anniversary dinner I hosted for the clinic staff, I walked through Bellamy House, turning off lights one by one. The dining room went dark. The study softened into shadow. The hallway photographs glimmered briefly, then settled. At the staircase, I paused and listened. No sirens, no glass breaking, no whispered question about how long before it looked natural. Only the quiet breathing of an old house that had seen greed enter wearing a wedding ring and leave in handcuffs. I touched the banister my father had polished with his own hands and whispered goodnight not to ghosts, but to the life that had held me until I could hold myself. Then I went upstairs, locked my bedroom door once, and slept without dreaming of poison. Survival was not the end. Revenge was not the victory. Freedom was waking the next morning and realizing no one who wanted me dead still had a voice in my home.